Right, it's a pleasure to talk to you today on two things that are really close to my heart. Firstly, the Gallipoli campaign and also signalling some of the problems that go through it. The thing I wanted to mention straight off is that because we are a Western Front Association, I'm standing here talking about the Gallipoli campaign. I do not believe the war could have been won anywhere else other than the Western Front. We needed to fight the main enemy on the main battlefield. Gallipoli campaign does not shorten the war by a day. It is absolute failure from its conception to its operational delivery to the end result. However, having studied it for the best part of 40 years, given all of the scenarios that were available in April 1915, I'd do it again. Okay? So that gives you some idea about why I'm interested in it, is that I can't get to the bottom of it. What else were we going to do? If we'd have sent those people to France, they probably would have died quicker and in greater numbers. And the only other options available to us were to launch a Salonika offensive early doors, which may sound tempting because it's a nice natural harbour, and also that the Greek Prime Minister was on side with this. However, the Greek king was married to the Kaiser's sister, so wasn't on side with it. So it was a bit up in the air. And what the Admiralty really wanted to do, because remember at this stage the Admiralty was very much of the opinion that the British Army was a projectile to be fired by them somewhere, was they wanted to land around the back near Kiel in the other side of Germany. If they'd have tried that, then the only thing we know is it would have been all over by Christmas. We just don't know which side would have won. So of all of the stupid ideas available, Gallipoli was the least stupid of those ideas. All right? So, someone who served in Gallipoli says this about the peninsula. It says, Gallipoli in itself has no particular attraction, for it is not a land flowing with milk and honey, and it is peopled by rough and illiterate peasants who, herded together in squalid hovels, scrape a bare subsistence from niggardly soil. And I looked that word up because obviously I'm a younger person, and that is it nothing to do with colour of skin, that word. It's an old English word for hard working. So that was Major John Ewing, who served out there at the time. Surprisingly, that's not the quote that's used by the Gallipoli Tourist Board today when you go and visit. And you'd argue, if you have been, and I know a number of you in the room have been with me before, it's anything but that. It's an amazingly, stunningly beautiful area with lots of diversity in its crops, and in fact there are 4 or 5 different battlefields on one small peninsula. But Major John Ewing, who served out there as a staff officer, felt that it wasn't his happiest memory of the war. And to a degree that sort of attitude pervades even today. So the first myth that I want to bust, not to an intelligent audience like yourselves, is that the Gallipoli campaign was not Winston Churchill's idea to kill as many Australians as he could, all right? That's not what occurs. Any Australians in? Sure they'll be watching on camera later. However, I should point out that the Australians, this is their first major action of the war, therefore it's their most memorable, in the same way that you find people talking about Mons, saying we could walk on a curtain of bullets, the fire was, horrific. It wasn't by the time you compare it to what you're about to go through, but when it was the first time you're being fired at, it really is quite something. And the whole of the Gallipoli experience is almost, in a way, part forges Australian personality and identity in the war in a way that they really didn't see as an option at the start of the war. So today, the myth is Australia fights the Gallipoli campaign, no one else. Where the reality is the Australians more than play their part in the Gallipoli campaign. In fact, there are 60,000 of them there, where there are 420,000 Brits. All right, so it's our campaign. It really is. There are more French soldiers at Gallipoli than there are Australians. All right, so it does come with lots of health warnings. Whenever you talk about Gallipoli, we will go into the Australian contribution because it is relevant and it is important, but it shouldn't be the end of the story, which unfortunately is far too often these days. So let's hone in on where is it for a start off. There you can see the Mediterranean Sea, the main battlefield being France and Belgium. It's off the map, to be fair, because we can just about see Tours down on the Loire Valley at the top of the map there. So to reach it, you really need to go by sea. And from here you can see the importance of Gibraltar, just at the entrance to the Mediterranean there. You can see the importance of Malta as well, just off of the Sicily to the south. And these are all important strategical, ancient, or certainly maritime coaling stations or places of natural importance. And in that little red box that you can, if any of you can see that on the screen, that shows you the Gallipoli Peninsula. Now, up until quite recently, people would tell you, oh yeah, Gallipoli is a sideshow, it's a waste of time really, Churchill's folly, blah de blah de blah. Maybe, just maybe, we are starting to think about that a little bit differently today with current world events. Because what is on the inside of Gallipoli, when you make your way up the Dardanelles and through the Bosphorus Sea and cross Constantinople, that is nowadays Istanbul, you can see there is the Black Sea, and Sevastopol, and it just marks the Crimean Peninsula, and the fact that then, as now, the only ice-free port facilities for Russia to get out into open waters is to come down through the Dardanelles Straits. So whoever controls the Dardanelles Straits controls access in and out of the Black Sea. And of course in 1914, they're our allies, the Russians, and we need to be able to assist them to get ships out and grain out, and we can get stuff back in. And Turkey has sided with the Central Powers at this stage as part of the Ottoman army, the Ottoman forces. They control it, so can we do anything to assist the Russians by forcing it? Because what is the size of the British Army in 1914? It's not huge, but what can we do? We command the seas. So if we want to make an international gesture, if we want to show our partners Russia and France, who with some validity by the end of 1914 are saying, we seem to be doing quite a lot here and you're not actually doing that much, this is our way of assisting in some way, which also is why the French are involved, because they're quite interested to know what we're doing, because they don't trust us that much in the same way we don't trust them. So all coalitions are troublesome because you all want the same result, but you all want it for very different reasons. Yeah, so it's not the easiest thing. So that's why Gallipoli was so important then. That's why it was so important when they go across to Troy, which is just on the other side, visible. You can see the site of Troy from Gallipoli. When Alexander crossed it on his bridge of boats, when we use it during the Crimean War. And that's also why Russia was siding with Syria, because they were hoping to build a huge naval base just off the Syrian coast, so they don't need to go in and out of the Dardanelles every time, they can operate from there. And it's still very important. I would say the third most important strategic waterway in the world, along with the Suez and the Panama Canals, is Dardanelles. So some sideshow, really, some sideshow, because this is a world war. The First World War is not fought at Albert and Ypres. It's a global campaign, but as Brits we tend to forget that. All right, so that's why we mention it. We'll just hone in on it, and you can see this is the Gallipoli Peninsula on the left. This is a wartime contemporary sketch. The most realistic thing to take on that is the blue line you can see up the hill is not actually a river that cuts it in two. That's actually the furthest limit of our advance in the whole of the Gallipoli campaign. That's as far as we get from the beaches on the tip up to that line. Similarly towards the north there, you can just see the Anzac little ring there where the Australians have landed. They land there because if they can get that high ground, then they can see down on the Dardanelles. What we're attempting to do at Gallipoli is never to land here and fight our way all the way to Constantinople. That would be ridiculous, and no one was ever suggesting that was the idea. The idea was the Navy are going to force their way up. When the Navy fails to force their way up, the Army will land. They will take out the battery positions on this coast that's preventing the Navy from getting up there, and then the Navy can go again. Yeah, that's basically the plan. But like lots of things in the First World War, we get dragged into an attritional campaign. From a signalling perspective, there are three inherent challenges to the Gallipoli campaign. The first is the terrain. Look at all those hills and spikes and what have you, and water. So any of you have any experience in communications know that you want a nice flat billiard surface to play on. Anything else causes you problems. Signals hit water and bounce over where you want it to be heard, so the people beyond it can hear it that you don't want to hear it because they're the bad guys. All right, so you've got to work within all of these restrictions, so you need to be able to understand the terrain and how to use that terrain to your advantage. The next thing that's going to be a problem for signallers is the operational complexity, and we'll have examples of that in that you've got the Navy and the Army working side by side. This is not as easy and as simple as you'd like to think. They're a queer old tribe, the Navy. They have strange words, strange traditions, and I'm sure they say the same about us. So we still argue about where the littoral is, right? At what stage does a maritime operation become a land operation and vice versa? As it was, the secret to Gallipoli was held by the Navy all along, in that Roger Keyes should have been the man that was put in charge of a lot of the military operations because he had the right attitude. And the Army actually causes itself problems at Gallipoli because it starts reading and disseminating and believing in doctrine that's coming from France. Simple things like pull onto a reverse slope because you want to avoid artillery. Yeah, in France, but actually the Ottomans don't have any, so why are we doing that? Before you land at Suvla, build up your headquarters and your supplies and get your guns ashore so that you can generate force. You can't generate force because there's not enough room. And secondly, the position's being held by a couple of gendarme units. What you need is speed, aggression, surprise to get in there. And someone like Roger Keyes may have made the difference if he was given the opportunity there. So that idea of working between the Navy and the Army at the same time, and then Russian Navy, French Navy, French forces, Australian forces, Indian troops, they're all mixed up, New Zealanders. There's lots of different layers there you've got to get across before we even start talking about the fact that the divisions, there's a brigade of Londoners, and then there's a Lowland division, then there's a Highland division, then there's Irish, and then, so even within our own, as a signaller, I used to sit in the back of my vehicle in Germany and I could tell you which battalions were calling because of regional accents on their phone. We wouldn't have to hear a call sign. You just hear it and go, oh, that must be them lot, So you've got that going on as well. And the third one, most important of all, is logistics. Getting the stuff out there. It's a lot of effort to get stuff from the UK out to here. It's one of the reasons why Indian troops are withdrawn from the Western Front, is not because it was too cold for them. You have to remember a lot of these Indian guys came from, the hill tribes of foothills of the Himalayas. So wet Flanders Plain's not an issue for them. It was more that how do we supply Indian troops in France when we've got British troops in India? Let's shorten those supply lines. And it's the same here to a degree. We've got to try and cut down those logistics. There's a guy called Rosie Weems that's put in charge of the naval logistics really supply here at the Isle of Imbros he works absolute wonders and manages to sustain the campaign as long as he does. But logistics is a problem. So your kit that breaks, you saw how quickly this broke, you've got to fix it pretty quickly. And you haven't got the spares and you haven't got supplies. So logistics are really quite important. So let's start with the first type of communications that we used, and it's this, ship to shore. So the commanding officer, the overall commander of the ground troops in Gallipoli campaign is Sir Ian Hamilton. You could argue he was the most talented general we had at the time. I'm still amazed that he wasn't selected to take over one of the corps in France, certainly when Jimmy Grierson dies. Hamilton was probably the most qualified man for the job. And in fact, the Germans said of him that he can fight in continents, not countries. So wherever he goes, they're really quite serious. So Hamilton is given the job of leading the ground troops at Gallipoli. And he positions himself on the Queen Elizabeth, which is obviously some way offshore. And from there, he's going to try and manage the battlefield as best he can whilst the ground troops are landing. The Queen Elizabeth plays a considerable role on the first day and throughout most of the campaign, actually, in bombarding as well. So let's do a little quote to give you an idea what Ian Hamilton says about the first day, 25th April 1915. My station is up in the conning tower with Admiral de Robeck. The conning tower is a circular metal chamber like a big cooking pot. Here we all are, all eyes, like potatoes in the cooking pot aforesaid, trying to peek through a slit where the lid is raised a few inches ad hoc, as these blasted politicians like to say. My staff are not with me in this holy of holies, but are stowed away in steel towers or jammed into 6-inch batteries. Now, what we know is that within the first hour of the Queen Elizabeth firing its salvos in support of the troops landing, all of the sensitive signalling equipment that the army have brought breaks. So they lose a lot of it, because you imagine the whole ship is going to rock when you fire, and I'm guessing naval signal kit is built to sustain that, whereas the army stuff, it wasn't designed to work on a battleship when it's firing these massive guns that they are, 12-inch guns or whatever they're firing at the time. Roger Keyes is there. Again, I bring him up, and it says, this is an interesting part about how signalling might have changed things on the first day. Roger Keyes started the notion that the troops that were landing at V Beach may well be diverted up to Y Beach, where they could land unopposed and whence they might be able to help their advance guard more efficiently than by direct reinforcements if they cut the Turkish line of retreat from Saddlebier. So what had happened is, up at Y Beach, we'd landed unopposed. 2 officers had literally walked into Krafia, walked back to say, what should we do now? There's no Turks here. They would have achieved all of the first day's objectives maybe if we'd have gone in there. It's not a huge landing zone, but it was unopposed. Whereas at V Beach, where everyone's landing, they can't get off the beach at this stage. So Key says, why don't you go up there, reinforce success instead of, where there is failure here. At the time, my Chief of Staff, Braithwaite, was rather dubious from a general staff point of view, whether it was sound for me as commander to barge into Hunter Weston's plans, seeing that he was meant to be in charge of the ground of the southern invasion. But it seemed to me common sense. If it did not suit Hunter Weston, he only had to say so. Hunter Weston was clearly in closer touch with the landings than I was. It was not for me to force his hands, but there was no question of that. But I did decide at 9:15 to wire the following message. GOC to GOC Euralius, which is Ian Hamilton, to Hunter Weston. Would you like to get some more men ashore at Y Beach? If so, I've got trawlers available to you. 3/4 of an hour passed with no reply, and the state at Saddlebier to the south, which is, you can see down at V Beach where most of them coming in, was no better. And in an attack, if you don't get better, you get worse. The supports were not being landed, no answer had come to hand, so I repeated my signal to Hunter Weston, making it this time personal from me to him and ordering him to acknowledge receipt. I said, General Hamilton to General Hunter Weston, Euralius, do you want more men landed at Y? There are trawlers available, acknowledge this signal. So it's a lot more curt, isn't it? It wasn't until 11 a.m. that I got the answer from General Hunter Weston, Queen Elizabeth, Admiral Weems, the Principal Naval Transport Officer, states that to interfere with his present arrangements and try and land men at Y Beach would delay disembarkation. So any opportunity there was lost because they weren't replying to each other signalling. We don't know whether that was because the kit was broken, did it take too long, or did the commander at the time, Hunter Weston, get dragged into what he could see in front of him and fight that battle, as opposed to step back and see what was going on across the whole way. Now I mentioned, in fact we both mentioned, alluded to the fact that when you're working with the other service, it's not always as easy as you think. And one thing that the Navy are very efficient at is they're pretty quick at Morse. 30 words a minute, yeah? So we were 16 words a minute and we could get up to 20. And we had these little things that go up and down like that when you do Morse code, whereas these guys had little flashy ones. Big budget, the Navy, like so it's twice as quick, And so it's nerve-wracking when you go and work with them. And so I've got an account here from a guy called Sam Sutcliffe, who was in the Essex Regiment in June 1915. He's told that he's going to join the Navy as a signaller because they're running out. During the evening, a nearby ship signalled an invitation to our captain to visit. Later we received a longer message, completely in cipher. One could not even tell to whom it was from and to who it was going. But we got the sender to repeat at every detail because we feared the slightest error would bring bad trouble down on our heads and disgrace our signal section. I found myself trembling as I handed the completed message to the naval officer. It all seemed so much more important than any other previous job I'd done. No doubt because I was working with a different service and I felt I had to do well and earn a good opinion. Dawn came, I rejoined our lads, I had some food and I settled down for a good long sleep. So he gets back to proper signalling, bit of grub, get your head down. But that pressure he feels when he's dealing with the Navy is quite palpable in his readings. Now, what we can see from this is that one of the things that Navy did exceptionally well is they had a resilient communications plan. And in fact, they designed a pamphlet before pamphlets were readily available in the armed forces at this stage of the war, which was called Signals Organisation for Combined Operations. Sounds like a riveting read, right? It was written for the Gallipoli landings. It was still being used in the Normandy landings, just updated. And it's really, how do you keep communications going when you're doing an opposed landing where the bad guys are shooting back at you? And the strength of this, for the first time, is that the communications, radios, visual, signalling, lamps, links ships, aircrafts and ground troops, all via a central wireless hub on HMS Queen Elizabeth. The guy who came up with it is a guy called Commander William Cotterill. He organised the entire system of land communication. He laid and repaired cable several times under fire despite being a commander, and on all occasions showed zeal, tact and coolness beyond praise, and for that he was awarded a conspicuous gallantry cross. I would be for an officer, wouldn't it, right? His Oppo, Yeoman of Signals Albert Bishop, was awarded a conspicuously gallantry medal, his citation says he showed great devotion to duty in action during Dardanelles. After his left leg had been shattered above the ankle, he raised himself into a sitting position and continued performing his duties and passing reports to his commanding officer. So, despite being wounded, he refuses to take any medical treatment and just get on with it. Another interesting element of this is, how do we speak to the air component? Then the air component of the Gallipoli campaign was all supplied by the Royal Naval Air Service. They had one land base, which is just by Hunter Western Hill, an emergency landing zone that was only used once or twice in the whole campaign. Other than that, they were flying off ships or off the island. One of the things they did have, I should say actually, number 3 Squadron, Royal Naval Air Service, on the first day through 26 missions. This was 2 seaplanes, and at any one time they were hovering over the 29th Division. So effectively they were taking off over the top, and then another one would take off and that would come down. This is what the RAF call the cab rank system, that they think they invented perhaps in the Second World War, but we've got examples of it being used here in 1915, really early on. So you've always got air cover, and that was over both the British and the French, and they would actually have 16 individual flights for each pilot throughout the day. It's a lot of sorties to run. There was provision for communication of the air service to speak to the ground, but you could only use that in absolute emergencies. So if they saw something that was really important and they wanted to tell the soldiers down below, they would be able to drop a message in a bag. They could try to signal it by a lamp, but other than that, it was quite difficult at the early stage of the campaign. They weren't working on the same radios or anything like that. We did land radios, I should say, at Gallipoli on the first day, both at Anzac and at Helles. The ship you see there is an interesting one. This is HMS Manica. Now this was a merchant naval vessel that was just doing its normal trade route, which was actually going in and out of the Port of London carrying manure. So it would fill up from the streets of London with manure, and then we'd transport it out and we'd sell it. It was full of manure when the Admiralty came along and requisitioned it, which meant some poor sailors had to clear the whole thing out, and they convert it into a balloon carrier, which balloons are really useful, a lot more useful than aircraft, because balloons are static, so you can see the whole view, right? If the general doesn't believe what's going on, you can say to him, come and have a look in the balloon, sir. You're not going to get him into a Sopwith pup or whatever, right? and also it gives you an oblique view as opposed to an overhead one, which is quite useful as well. So balloons are very useful. We do have a few of them here. They're surprisingly hard to hit. An aircraft is easy to shoot down, easier than a balloon. Because if I'm firing an aircraft, I just go behind it, and eventually I hit it. If I'm trying to fire at a balloon, missed it, and you keep going past it. So you need to be a long way out and fire at it static, and it took us a long time to learn that. So balloons were quite critical. From HMS Manica, within an hour of the Anzacs landing on 25th of April, they were in communications with Hamilton again. So due to the balloon, we were able to do wireless communications to speak back to the general commander. Doesn't always work well. Those of you that know Gallipoli will recognise the picture on the right is actually on top of Hunter Western Hill, which was the headquarters for the opening phase of the battle for the British there, looking down towards Lancashire Landing Cemetery, and this is actually roughly the area of the airfield here, which is why I've used this image. And the guy you see on the right hand side of the screen is Commander Sampson of the Royal Naval Air Service. Now Hugh Dolan wrote a very good book about the Gallipoli Air War, and he made a really important point about what was going on here. He said there was no training for integrated communications between the aircraft and the Field Brigade artillery. It rendered air observation ineffectual. The observers tapped out corrections with their Morse keys in the aircraft, so they would go up, artillery would fire, and they'd be watching, and when it fell short or went too long, they would put the corrections down, yeah? So they tapped out corrections on Morse keys to the gunners in the artillery, but unfortunately, the army receiving stations were on a completely different bandwidth and couldn't pick any of them up. And eventually, it was only when the Royal Navy ships nearby said, "Who are you talking to? Because it doesn't make any sense to us." So you've got the ideas there, send an aircraft up and can spot for you, but no one thought it through that their radios and their frequencies are entirely different, so no one's going to be able to hear it anyway. So what this led to was a rather comical scene that instead these aircraft landed in this field, ran across to the hill where the gunner officer was, put their fingers onto the gunner's map and said, "You're landing short," then ran back again into the aircraft and took off. Eventually then they decided, do you know what, it'd be quicker if we dropped flares. So they started dropping coloured flares, which is a good idea, isn't it? Really makes it. But when the coloured flares were dropped, all the Turkish gunners, the Ottoman gunners, meant that the first thing they did was start packing up and clearing off because they realised that they'd been seen and they went into cover. So the whole thing doesn't work from the get-go, which is not ideal. Perhaps the most famous type of communication, once we get on board, is wire communications. And this is the toughest bit, really, of signalling, is using wire in many ways. All army signallers, including myself, have got a lovely little chip on our teeth there that we're quite proud of, and it comes from continually stripping cables, because you can never find the, so you just strip this bit of cable and it breaks your tooth off eventually. But wire is not intelligent. The type of wire we're using then, like we were in my days, we called it Don 10, there's a slightly different, is you run it out and it tends to not decide, I'm going to bury myself, I'm actually going to go straight over a field, I'm going to be attract all ground fire, so I'm going to brake quite regularly, and it's going to mean some signaller's going to have to get out and try and find one end and then hook it up into the other end. And on a crowded battlefield, certainly on the Western Front, sometimes there's lots of wire out there, you don't know who's who, which is why Blackadder picks up the phone and it's Major von Schwunk asking for a table by the window, because it's easy to plug into the enemy's wire. And similarly, it's not secure. You don't need to actually plug into that wire to hear it. With a listening device, you can be, half a metre either side and you can still pick up what's going through there. So it's far from secure. Now, more recently, a brilliant diary has been released. I'd recommend it wholeheartedly to any of you that have not read it yet, by Alec Riley. It's called Gallipoli, 1915. And he was a signaller with the 1st East Lancs Divisional Signals Company. And he talks about one of the problems that he had as a signaller landing wire. It says, early on the morning of Wednesday, May the 12th, our line was found to be no good at all. Pearson, Dale and Withington came to us. From their tempers, they seemed to have enjoyed a very bad night. It appeared also that they had followed the wrong wire from brigade and had been mixed up with some mud. I went out to look at our line. We followed it along the side of a shallow nullah until it ended in open country near Criffia. Our nullah was about 350 yards long and we called it Dead Man's Gully. Snipers were very busy, so we took care of ourselves in the shallow parts, and when we had examined 200 yards of line, we decided we'd done more than enough of our duty. I've actually got a map here. That's your man on the left-hand side, about to go out to repair the wire, and we've got a map of the area where he went up to, Dead Man's Gully. You can just see it stretching up there. And he goes on to say, Dead Man's Gully had been held by a battalion of the 29th Division and held with a certain amount of trouble. We found a few dead men with ground sheets thrown over them, and we discovered one body so suddenly that the surprise was rather unpleasant. In one place we found it full of rifles, equipment, helmets, clothing, the contents of haversacks, forks, spoons, Bibles, prayer books, small personal possessions and thousands of rounds of ammunition. It was a very lonely and depressing place, and we were glad to get back to our trench, particularly as the passing bullets made us very windy. So even a simple thing like going out and repairing a wire at night is not fun in the Gallipoli campaign, and just tripping over dead bodies can't be much fun either, can it really? Perhaps the most famous signaller of the campaign, and again you can see him running line there, is this chap here. This is Cyril Royston Guyton Bassett, who was a bank clerk from New Zealand when he enlisted in the New Zealand Signal Corps, and he was the only New Zealander to be awarded a Victoria Cross in the whole of the Gallipoli campaign. He was the last Victoria Cross holder left alive in the Gallipoli Association. I think he died something like 1987, 1988. It's quite late on. Because he used to famously say, when asked about his Victoria Cross, he'd always say, of course I got a Victoria Cross, but all my mates got were wooden ones. That was his sort of like, that was his statement he'd like to make. But he was in charge of a section at the initial day of the landings, and with 5 other signallers in his unit, and he laid down telephone lines between brigade headquarters right up to the front line in what was a very confused area and a very challenging environment, Anzac. Helles is nice sloping slopes. Yeah, there's a lot of Turks shooting at you, but the ground's fairly okay. Anzac, it's not somewhere you want to be. It's so confused in its terrain and what have you. But really he came to his own in August when the New Zealanders successfully capture the top at Chanat Bear. And for the briefest of moments, Gallipoli's back on. For the briefest of moments, we can actually see down to the Dardanelles, and everything we've been trying to achieve is in sight. Just for the briefest of moments. Counterattack means that doesn't last too long. However, it says here that in August, working on those exposed slopes of Chanat Bear, he braved continuous gunfire, armed only with a revolver and a bayonet at this time. At one stage, a bullet strikes his boot. 2 more pass through the fabric of his tunic during the fighting, but he wasn't actually physically wounded. After the battle, his name, along with 5 other signallers, were collected by a chap called Arthur Temperley, Brigade Headquarters, who nominated Bassett for the Victoria Cross. And a few days after this, he was evacuated from the peninsula with a case of Gallipoli trots, which was, disease was a bigger problem as the enemy in Gallipoli. Most people at some stage come down ill whilst they're there. It's effectively a form of dysentery, and he spends months recuperating in a hospital in Leicester, and it's while he's in hospital in Leicester that he's told he's awarded the Victoria Cross. And the citation says, for conspicuous bravery and devotion to duty on the Chanat Bear Ridge in the Gallipoli Peninsula, 7th August 1915, after the New Zealand Infantry Brigade had attacked and established itself on the ridge, Corporal Bassett, in full daylight and under a continuous and heavy fire, succeeded in laying a telephone line from the old position to the new one on Chanat Bear. He was subsequently been brought to notice for further excellent, most gallant work connected with the repair of telephone lines by day and by night on very heavy fire. He was awarded the VC by George V at Buckingham Palace in February 16. And Bassett himself said, "I reckon there must be some guardian angel looking after me, especially as one man was shot dead in front of me and another man was wounded just behind." He's commissioned, serves on the Western Front, is decorated again, and at the end of the war goes back to being a bank clerk in the same branch. And then when the Second World War takes place, starts off again, he volunteers again for the Signals Corps. He's still a blank clerk, the same desk in the same branch. He hasn't taken promotion, and he ends up heading the whole of New Zealand communications in the Second World War. And when that ends, he goes back to being the bank clerk again. So you know, he really does come alive when it comes to warfare. Now, this is an account that's come to me quite recently. It's another book. It's Susan Burnett. I took her to Gallipoli actually, and she wrote her granddad's diary up. It's on the day I left my boyhood behind, and it's quite a sad but quite an amusing little article, really. In some ways, it says a lot about how awards are awarded in the military system that we could all whinge about, no doubt. His name was Norman Woodcock. He was in the 29th Division Royal Engineer Signal Section, and this little page is just called Woodcock's Medal. It says, "My duty commenced on this particular day at 6 a.m. in the signal office on top of Hunter Western Hill. My unit ran the signal office of the 29th Division and another section alongside the Naval Division. Amongst the lines we were responsible for was the one to French headquarters in Saddlebier Fort. At 9 a.m. a terrific bombardment began from Achibaba, the hill in front of us, and also from the Asiatic shore across at Hellespont, near to Troy. The noise was tremendous and the ground shook beneath our feet. The big guns on the Asiatic side were known as Asiatic Annie, and another as Moaning Minnie. Moaning Minnie could be heard like a thump, like a gun firing, then a long howl, and gradually increased to a great crash, and there would be a huge cloud of black smoke as it burst. These guns were all German Krupp's guns, and they ranged from anything from 5.9 to 12 inch. When they fired salvos together, it really was quite something. That day, as the bombardment continued, I had to walk backwards and forwards along the trenches as the shells continued to burst and damage the line. To miss the shells, I occasionally dropped into a dugout and then out again, testing the line. I went off towards French headquarters because our generals needed communications with them. The French troops were all in the dugouts as this was a particularly heavy attack. Even the gunners had left their guns and come to shelter from the bombardment. There were many casualties among them, some quite revolting, where a shell had burst nearby and disemboweled some of them. These were big shells and they made a big mess of men in dugouts. That day I repaired the line 52 times and kept it working, but by 4 p.m, after 10 hours working on my own under fire and not having any rest, food or water, I was simply exhausted. It was a cardinal rule, however, that a linesman remained on his line to keep it open until he was called in. But I felt compelled to go to the NCO in charge to send a relief as the line was then working. He was annoyed at me for suggesting I was relieved, but reluctantly agreed and sent along Baxter to relieve me. Baxter arrived at 4:30, I struggled back to my lines and shattered fell into the dugout. He arrived at 4:30 and the bombardment completely ceased at 5 p.m, and Baxter wandered back to the trench, waking me up. He was subsequently awarded the Serbian Gold Cross, which became known in our unit as Woodcock's Medal. What mystified me is why he was decorated with the Serbian Gold Cross, as we had no Serbs in the campaign. In fact, few of us even knew where Serbia was. So basically, he stags on for the whole of the battle, and half an hour before it ends, he's relieved, and the guy who relieves him gets the medal. And he goes into a big rant about how awards are awarded to the wrong people and sometimes to the right people. I'm sure we could swing the lamp about that all day, my naval friend, no doubt. Perhaps the most desperate and obvious form of signalling is visually, literally waving your hands up in the air. This is real last gasp stuff, really, when you get to do this. It looks great on the left there. It's Salisbury Plain, someone spotting for you and you sending out those wonderful things. What you don't want to be doing is like an Australian signaller in Anzac about to step up and start waving flags around. I mean, how much of the, there's not many of James Alexander Gordon's football results you're going to get out before eventually you're shot. You probably get as far as Charlton Athletic 0, and then you've been shot and you have to fall on the ground. So it's really last gasp desperation when you start waving flags. One of the guys I want to highlight is a real hero of mine. This is Sidney Hall. So as a tour operator and employing guides, I think over the years I've employed 40 odd different guides over the years. Quite often someone comes to you wanting to be a guide because their route to being a guide is their interest in their local regiment or the regiment their granddad served. And that's wonderful. Love all that. Unfortunately, you can't do every tour about the 10th King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry for the rest of your life. Well, you might be able to, actually. Generally, that's not what you want to do. So one of the things I say to guides straight away is go and find yourself a Scottish, a Welsh, an Irish, an Australian, a Canadian, a New Zealand and an Indian unit, adopt them and learn about them. Because if you just focus channel that energy on one unit, you will learn a lot more about it. So that you don't think, oh my God, how am I going to understand the Anzac Corps? Because that's what worried me. And I was sat in an airport flying back from Canberra, actually, up to Sydney about 25 years ago. And there was a book there, the 10th Battalion, the AIF History. And I thought, I'll give that a read. And by the end of my time, on that trip, I thought, I'm going to adopt this unit, and started learning more about it. And from there, I became quite competent talking about Australians in general because I could focus it back to what I felt my local unit, even though I'd never been to Morfettville in Western Australia, where they were from, or Southern Australia, where they're from, I should say. Their signalling officer is this guy, Captain Sidney Rogerson Hall. He was the local sort of GPO Morse operator back in the village. So when the regiment was raised, battalion was raised, he volunteered to go into signalling, and he trained them efficiently. So they felt that when they left Australia to head towards Egypt, where they were initially, they were some of the finest signallers in the whole of the Australian Imperial Forces. When they were at Egypt, they won regularly lots of competitions about how you could send the best Morse, the most efficient messages, that sort of thing. And Gallipoli, the landers at Anzac, are so confused, and we still argue today, were they dropped in the wrong place? Were they dropped in the right place? Did the place that they're meant to be dropped in change the night before, which it looks like they were? Whatever happens, instead of all landing at Anzac Cove, where they would all been shot up on the beach, they actually land around a peninsula on either side in the wrong order. When I mean in the wrong order, the first boat to strike the shore is actually the signals company of the 10th Australian Imperial Forces, not the ones that were meant to land first. And it's at that point that I remind you that as a signaller, you're a soldier first, a signaller second. So you can't sort of say, don't shoot yet, lads, at us, we just let our infantry come on, yeah? They had to go up and capture Pluggy's Plateau, scramble straight up into the objective. Hall is leading his men on, whilst the infantry are landing in the wrong places around him, his rifle companies, not sure what's going on. They don't suffer too many casualties on the landings, mainly because it's protected where they do land, but Hall can see when he gets up onto Pluggy's Plateau, there are very few Ottomans opposite him. And if we keep momentum going, we might be able to get to our objectives. And so there's no chance to run wire, there's no wireless working at the moment, so he pulls out flags and starts to flag messages back. And he's last seen surrounded in smoke, clouds, signalling a message for more support and giving locations of Ottoman fire points when he's shot. So absolutely falls in his line of duty, and he's buried in that wonderful beach cemetery, which everyone goes to visit because Simpson, his donkey, is buried there. But in the next block just behind is where Sidney Rogerson Hall's buried. So I always make a point of going and seeing him, because that is a proper signaller who really, I think if he'd not been the only officer there, that would have been a VC. But as he was the only officer there at the time, who's going to actually put him in for it? Australians, it's interesting at Gallipoli actually. We know that the British award 6 Victoria Crosses at Lancashire Landing and 3 more down at V Beach and what have you. And the Australians are like, well, hang on a minute, why don't we get any? And that's led to, even today in modern day Australia, sometimes, they wouldn't give them to us because we're Australian. Well, that's not quite right, because when they said, why haven't we got any? He said, we haven't filled the forms out. What forms? This is how you have to do it. Oh, right. So they get their forms in order so that on the 7th of August, the Battle of Lone Pine, they're awarded 7 or 8 or 9. So it wasn't that we wouldn't give awards to Australians, it was there was a process and they needed to fall into that process. Once they grasped it, there's no doubt in that they were able to be awarded like everyone else. Another signaller that was operating, and these are two wonderful watercolour sketches that he made of the Gallipoli area when he was there. A guy called Ellis Silas of the 16th Battalion AIF in May 1915, and he remembered this little valley, and on the ground I could take you there. It's not far from Russell's Top really, but it looks just like that today when you go there. And he says, it was across this exposed spot that many times I had to run dispatches. The ridge on the right where shrapnel can be seen bursting, and that's the right hand image, you can just see some shrapnel bursting. Looks like a bush, but it's shrapnel, was thick with snipers who had this patch so well set up that they really missed their mark. The poor chaps seen in the drawing nearly all got caught when trying to get across. I wondered if I was about to join them. Snipers created a considerable amount of dust every time I got up to signal. In fact, they had a real merry time, but being so sure of their mark, they became careless. Well, whatever the cause, they didn't get me. The feet above me in the picture are those of a buried comrade. It was not unusual occurrence when digging in to come into contact with a grave. Pretty grim stuff, isn't it? What we should mention is, of course, wireless communication. There's your sort of standard on the right-hand side is the wireless setup in a bunker, usually surrounded by loads of boxes of Jacob's biscuits and things like that. And then on the left, you can see out in the field in a little shell hole with his mast upwards there is the sort of more casual signaller up towards the front line. Now, I should mention the problem with wireless communication at the time is that it's heavy. It's not the wireless technology that's the problem, it's the battery technology. Just think about our mobile phones when we first had them. They were that size because of the batteries, right? Now they're tiny because batteries are tiny, and it was the same with this. So often the batteries would come along a wagon with the batteries on it. So it wasn't that mobile, not as mobile as you think. In fact, one of the problems they had in aircraft was that the batteries are so heavy it would prevent the aircraft from taking off. The other problem we have is one, and this is a little bit of antennas propagation for you, but it's relevant, is that the only signal you could throw was omnidirectional. All right, so what we want to do as a signaller is I want to fire my signal straight through the Chris so no one else hears it. I can do that down a dipole, like a little goal net really, so that it goes there. Omnidirectional antennas we had in the First World War meant a bit like RKO films, the signal just gets bigger and bigger and everyone can hear it. So it's not ideal. We've not yet learned how to throw things down a narrow corridor, which is so important. At Helles Beach, there was a quite horrific incident that occurred where the signal hut gets hit, and I'll just a couple of reports of it here. It says, I regret to report the signals office was wrecked this morning at 12:30 p.m. by a shell killing 5 and wounding 4 of our men. There are also several men unknown who were sheltering in the office doorway who were either killed or wounded. The following is a list of our casualties, and he lists them all by name. We'll come back to that in a bit. I'd recently left the signal office and at that moment was outside my dugout, and seeing the office was struck, I immediately returned. Although only a few seconds had elapsed, I found that Corporal Walker was already commenced removing wounded and that everything possible was being done for their comfort. Men were at once dispatched to the Royal Army Medical Corps for stretchers, and the office was quickly cleared. Finding that the AC current was in circuit, I informed them what had occurred and asked them to inform GHQ as it's imperative the undamaged instruments should be removed immediately. I issued instructions to run a lead from the terminal pole to the signals office, fix up the instrument, inform each man in turn what had happened. The office came in, a new circuit and a new lead was run, and instruments were fixed up as expeditiously as circumstances admitted. In conclusion, I have to report that practically the whole of our men off duty under Sergeant Wright came to the signals office immediately after the explosion and rendered valuable assistance. Perfect order was maintained throughout. Corporal Walker acted throughout with splendid presence of mind under such terrible circumstances. It's a standalone report in divisional history, but then when you cross-referenced it with other accounts, they talk about the same incident. So John Gillam, who wrote Gallipoli Diary, who was an Army Service Corps major, later in the morning we got a few explosive shells from Atchi. One pitched clear on the roof of our signals office, which is a timber erection, sandbagged and proofed against splinters. There the clerks work, tap, 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 buzz, 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 to all and from all over the peninsula. Messages being sent and received every minute, almost all day and all night, like a central telegraph office in London. Down came the shrieking thing, a deafening report, splinters of timber, torn sandbags, dust, stones and smoke flew into the air, and then silence, a pause, and men rush, not away, but towards the ruined office. 9 men and 1 signals officer had been killed outright, and several were carried up the cliff to the hospital. And then finally, just the account by one of the Army Medical Corps that says, on another occasion, 1 shell fell into our station on W Beach, killed 6 officers and men, several wounded, around 13. So all the numbers are slightly different. It completely disorganised the working of the signals, yet 39 minutes later, our people were going again, tap, 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 buzz, buzz, buzzing. On this evening, we were operating till midnight on the wounded in the 89th Field Hospital at W Beach, the effects of a single shell. So within 39 minutes, they had that signal up and running. Now, there's your sort of wagon run radio. Now, what I was intrigued in is Lancashire Landing Cemetery. There is a whole row of Royal Engineers in one row. And of course, when I went to look, all of their names are these guys. Corporal Taylor, Elliot, Williamson, Ward, Ball, Terrell, Cook. And I realised I'd found the plot that had occurred in this incident, the ones that had been dragged up the hill. So next time you go into Lancashire Landing Cemetery, and we always go in and look at Keneally, the Victoria Cross holder, just a few rows back is all those lads that were working the signals office when it took a direct hit. And actually that's a photograph of the original grave as it looked in Lancashire Landing. Now there's another form of communications that's important that I really did want to mention, partly because it's such a great story, and that is dispatch riding. That also comes under our remit. The white helmets, you remember those? You used to go, Jim will fix it, you can't say that anymore, but you know, they're all stand up, make all that sort of stuff. They were of course the Royal Signals display team, motorbikes display team. But at Gallipoli it wasn't only bikes. We'll come to bikes in a moment, because this on the left is an actual wartime shot of the dispatch riders that were multinational. They weren't just Australians doing this. And I've got an account written by General Sir Harry Cheval, who was a very high up Australian commander at the time. It says, following the landings at Suvla Bay in August 1915, we found it necessary to organise a dispatch rider service between headquarters at Suvla and headquarters at Anzac. The distance was 6 miles, and almost the whole of the route was exposed to rifle fire from the Turkish trenches on the ridge overlooking it. The mail used to leave Suvla in the morning and return from Anzac in the afternoon. It had to be done at the gallop, and the rider was fired at from the time he left the shelter of Lalababa until he reached the wide communication trenches near to Anzac. Yet all of the light horsemen, New Zealand mounted rifles and British yeomanry were tumbling over one another to get the job. And fortunate indeed was considered the regiment which had to find the men for the duty. The ride was one of the daily entertainments. Everyone on the left of Anzac knew the moment the mail left Suvla for the rattle of Turkish musketry, which began on the extreme left and continued along the line until the rider was safely in the communication trench. Strangely enough, this went on for nearly 3 months before either a rider or a horse was hit. There was always heavy wagering whether the post would get through, and it is probably that Johnny Turk had the same bet as us as well. But what an adventure, isn't it? And that's actually someone's taken a picture of that guy on the gallop. And it's a wartime photograph. We can see the transport ships off the shore. This is somewhere down near Embarkation Cemetery. Galloping away, isn't it? Now on the right, you'll see the more obvious type of dispatch rider we think of, which is those on motorbikes. And you think, well, they're a bit strange to get around Gallipoli, but they had them. Trusty Triumphs or Douglas 500s. Actually, there wasn't a uniformed bike. Everyone had their own bike and they set it up the way they wanted to set it up. But they were an efficient way of getting around the Gallipoli campaign. Now this photograph you see quite a lot, right, on the Gallipoli, don't you? That guy there. It's usually cover of books or what have you. This one, not so much. I don't know if you know the big one. Do you recognise that? Any of you seen that before? This is potentially one of my favourite PALS units of the war. In fact, it's a reverse PALS. This is the dispatch rider section of the Royal Engineers that served at Gallipoli. And at the end of the war, their officer got a job for the AA, and these men became the first AA patrolmen. So rather than all enlisting in the same job and joining the army, they all joined in the army and demobbed into the same job. So these were your original AA patrolmen. This is actually taken on Imbros, not on Gallipoli itself. And if you've got a keen eye and you're an anorak like me, you can see they're wearing different types of headdress. Some of them have got central lights, some have got horns, some have got what have you. But the guy that really interested me straight away was the guy here on the far right by his headset. His headdress he's got with those goggles. He's got a central headlight, whereas there's very few that have. And the one that has further along is a different type of bike. But if you actually look at that guy and the one I just showed you, they're the same fat chap. Yeah? So we've got him in the trench at Gallipoli, and then we've got him here as well. They used to run up the West Crofia Road, Pink Farm, Skewbridge, that sort of area. And perhaps the most famous dispatch rider that served at Gallipoli was an Australian. There's a chap you can see there on the far right. This is called Charles Kingsford Smith. Some of you might know that name, may have heard of that name. He was actually, after Gallipoli, transferred into the Royal Flying Corps, where he was awarded a military cross. He was shot down over France. Post-war, he became a barnstormer stunt pilot, which is quite an interesting job. And he actually took part in the first Trans-Pacific flight in 1928. And then in 1935, he disappeared at sea, attempting the speed record between Australia and England in an aircraft. And the reason you might have heard that name if you've been to Australia is that they named Sydney Airport after him. So when you fly in and out of Sydney, you come into Kingsford Smith Airport. And it's named after this chap who was a Gallipoli signaller, which I thought was a nice little story. Now, I did mention there's a wealth of books available. There's the Alec Riley book on the left, memoirs. The two on the right, very hard to get these days, one being an Australian, one being New Zealander. Luckily, I've got quite an extensive collection, plus a hotline to Tom Donovan when any signaller's memoirs come in. He rings me up and says, you haven't got this one yet. So I tend to get most of the stuff that comes around. One of them that's quite an interesting account is Sam Sutcliffe. We mentioned him a little bit earlier. There he is on the right. He's with the Essex Regiment. And he were just a few accounts of what it was like to actually be on the ground as a signaller. I had to move around constantly. As a signaller, I had no choice. When our comrades built and occupied new trench works, we had to run out lines and man the instruments, maintain communications from battalion headquarters. 50 yards or so from one end of our company headquarters was a collection of holes where I still lodged from time to time. There was also a clump of trees and bushes nearby, and one morning I was amazed to hear a voice coming in that said, "Divine, quite divine." The bearer of that name I knew to be an officer's servant, and the voice belonged to Lieutenant Chalk, the battalion dandy. Crawling that way, I came across Mr. Clark sitting naked in a hip bath, and fortunately he was unaware of my presence. So there he was having a lovely bath, naked, with his servant divine pouring water over him, which sounds like a nice way to be a signaller, doesn't it, really? He does go on to say, we never had a satisfactory sleep, so we experimented with 2 on, 2 off, 8 on, 8 off, every arithmetical combination we could think of to cover 24 hours, but nothing ever worked. Whenever you took over, whatever interval, your mate, released from the crampy corner of a hole we lived and worked in, should have felt free for some hours of beautiful sleep. But was he? Not really. Because on duty, you must want to go to the bog at some time, so your mate had to wake you up and take over. During the day, you would need nourishment, so your mate had to procure it and often cook it for you on a small mess heater. Actually, we catnapped day and night, and we just made the best of what was a very terrible existence. The resulting fatigue, along with a poor diet, was reducing us to shadows of ourselves. They sent our rations up to us every 2 or 3 days. As before, our staples remained very plain: hard biscuits, apricot jam, and tea boiled with our methylated spirit heaters. Corned beef was the only meat supplied with any regularity, though occasionally a few rashers of bacon came our way. Look again at that food list, and imagine yourself trying to live under such conditions and maintain your intelligence or even keep your sanity. And it wasn't just Brits that suffered. This is Bill Ledley. Isn't that a wonderful photograph, the guy on the right there? Bill Ledley was a New Zealander in the Signal Corps as well, operating out of this little hut you see, very neat and tidy. The one on the left, but the guy on the right is Bill Ledley. And he talks about some of the kit they had. I had to see that all the signalling gear was taken ashore. This was on the initial landings. It included 8 heliographs, a device for signalling in Morse code using the sun's rays and a movable mirror, 8 Begbie lamps, 2 bicycles, and numerous items such as flags, stationery, telescopes and field glasses. When we were a dozen yards from the beach, the barge is grounded and we were ordered to jump in the water and wade ashore as quickly as possible, as by this time we were under heavy shrapnel fire. I was the last to leave my barge, as I was responsible for all the signalling gear getting off. This meant supervising 2 or 3 trips backwards and forwards with some of the men. When I jumped into the water, it came up to my neck. I held my rifle above my head and waded towards the shore, but halfway there I stumbled into a hole in the sea bottom and went right underneath the water. When I came up a few seconds later, I found I was the only survivor of the group from this barge. Undoubtedly, this saved my life. I lost my rifle, but soon managed to scramble out of the hole and reach the beach safely, and I quickly obtained another rifle from a dead Australian and joined up with the rest of the signallers on other barges who'd gone on ahead. Now, some of the kit that they were being issued with was absolutely antiques. I mean, literally, it was 30 years old. They were taking it to Gallipoli. So really old wooden stuff, doesn't last the test of time. Ledley stays in there. He talks about his birthday, not very nice really. August 11th, my birthday. What a birthday it's been. I've not had a wash or a shave for over a week and I'm feeling very creepy. Turks are still holding us up. We're having another go at them today. Jock Mann returned from hospital at Alex yesterday. He and I were sitting on the parapet of our trench this afternoon having a cup of tea. He was giving me an account of his experiences in Alex when a Turkish sniper bullet whizzed past within an inch of my ear. The next moment I saw a red spot appear on Jock's forehead. He fell forward into my arms, shot through the brain. We got him down to the dressing station as quickly as we could, but he was dead when we arrived here. Turks have been shelling our trenches pretty heavily all day, so we have to lie low. Wells, who's a good telegraphist, was hit by a piece of shrapnel and taken away to hospital. He got the shrapnel through the knee. I got a piece in my left arm, but it wasn't serious, so I put iodine on it, bound it up and carried on. There's only 5 signallers left now out of the original 18 who landed. I'm now in charge of all communications. This is the saddest part. A few days ago, a trawler with 150 bags of mail for us on board capsized and sunk between us and Imbros. I expect most of my birthday cards and letters would have gone to the bottom of the sea. Imagine that as a bit of morale, seeing that ship coming in and then absolutely losing it. Now you can always expect an Australian to lighten the mood somewhat, and this is a guy called Harold Hinkfuss, who was a signaller. He talks about some of the kit. I mentioned it being antiquated. He said, my first job was at Taylor's Hollow to set up a switchboard. It was an antique, probably used in the Sudan War. It had a crossbar made of brass. The first edition of Paul's Telephony shows it as the first piece of apparatus made after the telephone was invented by Graham Bell in 1873. The field telephone consisted of 3 separate parts: a leather strap which held the earpiece, a transmitter which was held in the hand, and a box containing the rest of the apparatus. It was a torch to have the earpiece strapped on your head, as the earth induction from the other stations was a constant buzz, in particular from some call sign called ESST from Suvla Bay, who interfered continually with our signals. The signalling lamp was also rather primitive. It consisted of a square cast iron box filled with shutters, which operated by pushing and pulling a rod at the top with an oil lamp placed inside. But the nice story he tells is this one, and I often think about it when I'm walking down off of Chanat Bear. It said, I was on the extreme left in a signalling post, and every night we received messages, all in code, from the Navy. One night I was in this lonely position, myself, Norm Whittard and Harry Muirhead, and we were on duty from midnight till stand 2 in the morning. The password that night was Woolloongabba. About 12:30 a.m. an officer came in. His name was Major Foster, the night officer on duty. He was a nice elderly fellow. After Whitty had told him about the situation was quiet and there'd been no movement or messages, he sat down and he told us that it was his birthday today. He'd received a parcel from a Navy vessel. It consisted of 2 chickens, 1 cake and a bottle of wine. We wished him a very happy birthday and he departed. It was cold and we were hungry and tired. Whitty suddenly asked Harry if I could hold the fort for a while, and away he went. We thought that he was going to the latrine, but lo and behold, he was back in about half an hour with a chicken under his tunic. We clawed it to pieces. He gave me a leg and a thigh and the same to Harry. I must confess it was delicious, and after we'd sucked the bones dry, we threw them over the precipice. About half an hour before stand to, the Major arrived back again. Whitty told him it was all well, so he sat down on the fire step. Harry asked him if he'd enjoyed his party. Yes, was the reply. It was very nice, but somehow or another one of the chickens had disappeared. He said, I suppose you would charge the man if you found out who took the chicken, sir? He said, no, I'd promote him to corporal in the Scouts. I had everyone guarding those bloody chickens. There we are. Lovely, isn't it? This is Percy Crone, and he describes this area where he was working. He says, the trench dies away at the rocky foot of Chocolate Hill, which is that slight rise we can see there. 50 yards to the left of my old post, and Essex Nullah, a gully running up the side. Besides manning 100 yards or so to trench across the valley. Y Company holds the forward end of Essex Nullah for a woefully thin line of men. Now, that's why I wanted to mention that, Y Company. Decent infantry regiments name their companies W, X, Y and Z. They're very thoughtful and considerate to us signallers. The reason why you have that is because there is nothing worse as a signaller as having an infantry battalion that has A, B, C and D company, and you're on HF. Is that B company? Yeah, I'll just go and get C company for you. No, I mean B company. Yeah, D's on his way. They all rhyme. So it makes perfect sense to have W, X, Y and Z because they can't be confused, yeah? So Essex Regiment, Royal Fusiliers, I think the Worcesters all have those later numbers which work really, really well. Anyway, the reason I was going to tell you that was because Percy is arriving as his first time as a signaller, and this is how the conversation goes. I dropped on my hands and knees, my ears pieced the gloom between the ground sheets, and I saw a man sitting at the far end. Sergeant Halliday? Me. My name's Croney, reporting for duty. Come in, and I crawl in and sit beside him. What can you do? Well, the lot, I hope, Sergeant. Men breaks in the line? When they're found. All right, take over. And unbuckling the earpiece from his head, he passes it into my hands. I strap it around my own head and I ask, where's the others? What others? The company signals, of course. Well, we are the signals, you and me. Well, how do you manage things then? 2 on, 2 off, day and night, week after week, until one of us dies. There's such a depth of despondency in his voice that my eyes, now tuned to the dim light beneath the ground sheet, search his face. If ever a man was really sick, it is this soldier. His tired, drawn, sallow face and yellow eyes almost shout the words Yellow Jack. Of course he should be in hospital, but he says nothing. I've learnt that regular signallers are, although they might silently be longing for a bullet or a shell splinter and to get away for a hospital, would rather die than report sick with an ordinary illness. It's quite something, isn't it? Yeah, so we are getting towards the close now. Perhaps the most famous signaller to serve in the Gallipoli campaign is this chap. This is Henry Moseley. So Moseley was a brilliant scientist who in 1915 was nominated for Nobel Prize or Nobel Prizes in physics and chemistry. His work using X-ray spectroscopy I guess that is, demonstrated the physical basis for the atomic numbers and made sense of the periodic table. Soon after the war broke out, Moseley enlisted into Kitchener's army as a signals officer with the RE Signal Service. He landed as brigade signals officer at Anzac Cove, and on the 5th of August 1915 was killed while sending a telephone report to divisional headquarters. He's commemorated on the Hellers Memorial there. Isaac Asimov wrote, in view of what Moseley might still have accomplished, his death might well have been the most costly single death of the war to mankind generally. I sort of wanted to mention that guy because firstly, it backs up my argument about signallers being quite bright, clearly, because not many corps. I mean, the Royal Engineers can claim to have won the FA Cup, but they can't claim to have invented the periodic table or added to it, right? So here's the chap. So again, it's worth going and seeking his name out. Another RE officer just above him is Siegfried Sassoon's brother, is on the same panel of the Helles Memorial. So really, to sum up, what was life like as a signaller? Well, that's on the left-hand side for you is one of the cigarette cards you would have been given at the time, with a signaller going up this telegraph pole under fire gallantly, stuff like that. Perhaps the best depiction ever is the one you see on the right. And to find that, it's almost a work of art. This is the work of Charles Sergeant Jagger, who was one of the many talented artists and architects that was employed by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission or Imperial War Graves Commission at the end of the war. And his most famous thing is the Artillery Memorial at Hyde Park Corner, or perhaps the letter at Paddington Station, if you've ever seen the memorial there of the soldier in bronze reading a letter from home. But this is on the Louverville Memorial at Cambrai, and there are two different relief panels built into the wall, and this one depicts a signaller, and it's absolutely incredible. It's got a Morse key on there. You can see the infantry who are jumping over the top. The fact that the officer has actually dropped his revolver has been hit. And you can just see the start of the stretcher. Actually, in the full thing, you can see on the stretcher a guy being carried, and he's gripping, absolutely gripping it with pain. It's little details on it is by someone who served to understand it. So that's my favourite depiction of a signaller in the war is Charles Sergeant Jagger. Jagger had served at Gallipoli and actually been decorated out there as an officer, so he knew all about it. Now, we've talked about signals being about high-tech technology, wireless, all this sort of innovations. What might have made the difference at Gallipoli? Well, this is something that was given to me by a signals veteran many years ago, so I thought I'd bring it along for you. This isn't his, but this is obviously a Lee Enfield rifle. This is a Royal Naval Division rifle that was used at Gallipoli. It's all got the volley sights and what have you. And the division itself, what they did was they decommissioned these immediately after the Gallipoli campaign, and they turned them into drill weapons so that anyone else joining the Royal Naval Division would be using a Gallipoli rifle to give them that feeling of esprit de corps. So it's all marked up to the Royal Naval Division. The most expensive thing about them nowadays, of course, is the bayonets, because a lot of the Gallipoli bayonets are what they call hook quillion. This thing here, it's meant to give you an advantage if you're in a bayonet fight with someone. They snap off, don't they, and breaks. There's not many left. So that fits on like so. But what I've got that was given to me by the signals veteran, and I've only ever seen one of these in the Imperial War Museum, and mine's in slightly better condition, is a very simple bit of apparatus. Because you see that's camouflaged on there, can't you? They didn't come in until 1917. This is 1918 version of it. Yeah? But what I can see that you can't is on that. And I've used this from Burlon Wood, corner of Burlon Wood, and one of the guys I know who's another signaller guide, he was at Flesquières near Deborah with some field glasses, and we successfully sent a message to each other, which we kind of cheated because as soon as he started sending it, I knew it was going to be get me a beer quick. But it would work, and I think something as low-tech like this in Gallipoli might have made all the difference. So rather than raising yourself above a parapet and waving flags, that is quite clear, isn't it, and quite clever. And so you can see why very few of them have survived, because they're so simple. So that is the story of Gallipoli's signalling campaign, and I'll do my best to answer any questions you've got, and if I can't answer them, and we've got a petty officer in the Navy who'll be more than happy to do it instead.